Hello and welcome to GreenFleet Talks. My name is Kate Armitage and I'm your host for our discussion today, and I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Rumboll, who is CEO at SYNETIQ. Tom, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you, Kate.
Great. Tom, today you and I are going to be discussing the transition to electric vehicles, some of the barriers to adoption and the role that government must play. But by way of introduction, Tom, can you tell me a bit more about SYNETIQ and the work that you're doing in the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for inviting me, Kate. So yes, I'm Tom Rumboll. I'm the CEO of SYNETIQ. SYNETIQ is the UK's integrated salvage and dismantling operator. So what does that mean? That means we return safe, compliant vehicles back to the road, vehicles that can be safely reused. We sell those to a group of registered buyers. And where vehicles aren't returned to the road, we harvest as many parts from those vehicles as possible to contribute to the circular economy and repair vehicles at lower cost, lower carbon, and lower time off road. So our mission in life is to support our fantastic clients in maximising the economic and environmental value of every vehicle that we receive.
Great. And presumably you deal with electric vehicles as well, whole new world for you?
We certainly do, yes. They're currently a small but a rapidly growing part of our vehicle stock.
Great. Okay. So, Tom, a lot of our fleets haven't actually begun their decarbonisation journey. So let's have a little chat about how fleet operators can judge the feasibility of electric vehicles within their operations.
Yeah, no problem at all. Just as a way of mention, a lot of our clients are insurance companies, but we also work with some of the UK's largest fleet operators and fleet management companies. So we're well versed in these conversations. What I would say, I've got some practical ideas. I'm not sure there's going to be a huge amount of new news in that. But before doing that, Kate, my first question would be why? I think those businesses that have yet to start the decarbonisation journey probably should ask themselves why they're doing that, because they really need to keep that why in mind as they go on that journey. Something that SYNETIQ is a proudly sustainable business. We have our why, and that's really helped us on our sustainability journey because we've always kept that in mind. But over and above asking the why, the big question why you're doing it would be business requirements. Have a really good look through your business. What do you need? Where? How do you currently operate? Would that need to change if electrification were to be a feature? That's payload, that's range, that's charging points, that's power access to sites for some of the very small, medium-sized businesses out there. Is sufficient power available from the DNOs, and we might touch on that. How will you incentivize staff? We have salary sacrifice. What about the additional financial cost of EV currently, while that disparity in price remains? So some really practical factors and practical considerations, but I think has to start with why, but then also a real good look at business operations first. So I think if you try to look at decarbonisation or tailpipe emissions or electrification away from serving clients, away from compliance, away from operational matters and risks and characteristics, that might quite quickly become difficult.
Yeah, and I think, I talk about operational change a lot because ultimately it's unlikely that you're going to be able to decarbonise your entire fleet without making operational change. But in the first instance, there is definitely low-hanging fruit, I think, that can be...
Absolutely, yeah, you totally agree. And people talk about low-hanging fruit, easy wins, quick wins. There are many and varied, and that can really help give some momentum. But the direction towards that activity really has to be with the end in mind, because I think with a holistic view of operational matters as well as sustainability matters.
Yeah, great. for fleets that have introduced electric vehicles, I think it's fairly well understood that the charging mostly takes place in the workplace or in a depot. And there's a lot of activity around employees taking their vehicles home. But the third area, which is probably the one that gets the most attention in some ways, although it's a fairly small segment, is the public charging network. And it has come in for some criticism recently, with people saying that the growth in the public charging network isn't matching the growth in vehicles that are coming onto the roads. What's your view on this?
Yeah, well, I'm glad you've asked me, Kate, because to me, that's a really weaponized, potentially divisive debate. You've hit the nail on the head. There's workplace charging, there's public charging. What are the facts? 44,000 EV charging points, 38% increase since June 2022, 42% increase in rapid chargers. And I think that's potentially really quite divisive to look so narrowly at public charging rather than the holistic charging infrastructure. And I think taking that to another extension, if you think about the whole power ecosystem and supply chain, it starts with generation, and it goes through transmission, then it goes to distribution through the distribution network operator, the DNO, and then the supplier. And what I don't read, and I read widely around this, and for me, there's just not enough detail and understanding mutually in the public consciousness and in sometimes the business consciousness that is a supply chain in its own right. It's not just about the charging infrastructure providers. It's about the distribution network operators. It's about the power suppliers. It's about the power distributors. And I think if we had a slightly more grown-up, adult, holistic view of the charging network, power supply, transmission, generation, the noise around not enough public chargers would disappear, because it's just a very, very narrow segment, and it can become, as I say, it can become slightly weaponized and divisive as a reason to not do something.
Well, I think it's absolutely true that this is what's being talked about in the press. It's not necessarily what's being talked about by electric vehicle owners, which tells you something anyway. Your point about the wider ecosystem is a great one. We at GreenFleet, we regularly have webinars and guest speakers from National Grid, and they are the transmission system operator, the energy system operator in the UK. They have a great document, which is their future energy scenarios, and they've done a lot of planning around electric vehicles. And you're right, if more people were pointing to that document and saying, read that, understand that, a lot of the fear around the public charging network, I think, and whether or not the grid can cope, would be addressed. So, I think it is not necessarily a helpful debate.
It's not, and what can I add to that is, well, the government are clearly committed to the ZEV mandate, and again, let's stop and think about why that is. We're in a climate crisis. So again, unhelpfully, the ZEV mandate and motorist rights and public charging takes public consciousness away from. Let's remind ourselves the reason why there's a ZEV mandate. It's because we've broken through 1.5 degrees commitment from COP26. We've seen more extreme weather than we've ever seen before. The hottest times on record are now. There's more parts per million CO2 in the environment than at any time in human existence. There's a reason why this is happening, and again, some of that gets lost in charge anxiety, range anxiety, not enough public chargers. But if we come back to why this is important, there's nothing more important.
It's a great reminder, an absolutely great reminder, and still we're getting resistance. Even the expansion of the ultra low emission zone in London has been deeply unpopular, even though it will benefit the people who live there the most in terms of air quality. Still unpopular. So again, we're back to this divisive comment that you made earlier. What are the, I mean, I do think that consumer education is part of the barrier in all of this, but what other barriers do you come across or do you hear being cited when it comes to electrification of transport?
Well, yeah, no, as a business that's striving and to be the most sustainable in our space, we're living those challenges. So this is not an arm's length observation. This is happening. It's the EV vehicle range, much talked about. That is a barrier, absolutely no doubt, for some business operations. The cost disparity will absolutely be a barrier. Infrastructure, and I've used that in its broadest sense, not just public charging or private or power. That's a potential barrier. The skills and capabilities from a EV trained mechanics, we see and we hear it all the time. There's a real shortage of new recruits into the automotive space, body repair particularly, but more so exacerbated by the fact that those that are currently in that space aren't necessarily trained on EV. So I would argue there's a capacity or a skills gap that needs to be closed. Then there's all the debate around, well, is it really green? Because if this vehicle has been charged on electricity from a coal-fired power station, or this is the tire wear that it creates on the road, or this is the embedded carbon footprint, and we talk about whole life costs. They're the barriers, and they're very, very broad and they're very general, but they exist for everybody. And that's, you conquer that, I believe, by knowledge. And that's why we work so closely with sustainability consultants. That's why we work so closely with Thatcham Research, the automotive risk intelligence specialists. So we work really closely with those in a number of ways to identify those risks in our business and for our clients, to make sure that we can keep momentum in our transition and do that in a way that is really cost effective, really compliant, but ultimately leads to a reduction in CO2.
Tom, that's a great discussion, and I absolutely love your point about conquering through knowledge. That is so true for all of this. The more knowledge that we can give people, the more accurate information. That's how we will overcome these barriers. The other area that I wanted just to discuss with you was government intervention, particularly in the transition to electric vehicles. You've mentioned the ZEV mandate, and there are still some grants available for EVs and infrastructure, public charging, and for businesses. But what more would you like to see government do?
Well, it often comes back to this, Kate. We all, industry actors, NGOs and others, we'll look for somebody or somebody to show leadership, and we will go to government. So before giving my version of that list, I would say it's essential. We can look at the pace of change. This isn't, markets won't make this move as quick as the earth needs us to. I think eventually they will, but if we want the right level of change and the right level of progress and the right level of CO2 and CO2 equivalent reduction, there has to be government intervention. That's essential. So I think I look at this sort of broadly and think, change, right? What does it need? It needs a vision. So what is the vision? ZEV mandate is part of that vision, but it's to me framed as part of are we a net zero economy by a net zero nation? Are we a net zero industry in automotive? And what is that vision? Secondly, where are the skills? We need the skills to develop and implement the vision. There's a big role for government there, I perceive, in education, in funding, in some of the kudos that comes with working in energy transition, sustainability, net zero roles. Big role there. Resource. We need the resource as an economy, but also as industries, to put the vision and the skills together. There needs to be an incentive, clearly. What are the incentives available to accelerate businesses, individuals, industries, ecosystems making that transition? And finally, is it part of a coherent industry plan? And sadly, I think much of that is lacking. But that is, to me, is the reality, that there is probably not enough incentive. There isn't necessarily the resource and the skills. There isn't any detailed planning, and we're not anchoring to an overarching vision. So what would be my ask? It's mandate collaboration, true collaboration between OEs, between DNOs, between the power supply infrastructure and transmission, and industry actors such as ourselves that are at the end of that life trying to maximize economic and environmental value, along with insurers, along with fleets, representative bodies. Mandate that collaboration, because it won't happen on its own. And it's been realistic with all of that. Clearly, it's not a short-term project. It's a long-term. But for me, there's grant availability, make it attractive for businesses, individuals, and ecosystems to make that transition. But money alone is not enough, because it needs direction, needs leadership, needs a common framework of taxonomy. It needs real long-term committed thinking.
And that, I think that's the point, this long-term committed thinking. It needs to come from government, and they need to lead by example, because uncertainty is unfortunately, could be our undoing. And at the moment, I think actually the auto OEMs and the energy industry and everyone who's involved in the electric vehicle ecosystem is showing more certainty and more commitment than we're getting from government in some levels.
I would totally agree. And from the SYNETIQ perspective, our purview is we work really closely with insurers. Absolutely committed. We're the leading edge of EV, end-of-life EV safety. We're working with OEs, interestingly, as they're looking to create circularity. We're working with recyclers, as I mentioned before, working with Thatcham, industry experts, working with sustainability consultants. So it's certainly not to overplay the role of the vehicle recycler in all of this, but it's also not to underplay the fact that
it's massively important.
At the end of that vehicle's life, there is a heck of a lot of CO2 saving to be had through the level of engagement with those industry actors that I've just mentioned. And certainly I see the conversations we're currently having, they're really positive, they're really well-intentioned, they've got a goal, but they're bilateral. It is between ourselves and the OE, it's between ourselves and the battery recycling, it's between ourselves and Thatcham and others, but ourselves and the insurers. To me, that the piece that is missing is that true collaboration.
Oh, Tom, you said it at the beginning. So thinking about the end of life of the vehicle and the recycling isn't the end of the value chain. If it's a circular economy, you're actually responsible for that second life and that additional value. It's so important.
It absolutely is. Yes, it is. And we know what's coming in terms of the percentage of a new vehicle that needs to be made from an old vehicle. We know what's coming with batteries. 2026, if I recall correctly, that the percentage material in a EV battery will have a minimum, will need a mandated by law a minimum amount of recycled content. The stage and the framework is being set. I think we're missing something in the now, which is that incentive, that clarity, that vision, the resources, the plan to take us to that.
Tom, you've given me some great insight and food for thought today, and definitely a new perspective on the discussion. So I'd like to thank you very much. It has been a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you. Pleasure's mine.
That is about all we've got time for. Thank you, of course, to SYNETIQ for joining GreenFleet Talks, and thank you for watching. Please tune in to GF365 again soon.